The fallen survivor. The wind carried the scent of scorched metal and burning sand across the endless dunes. The night sky stretched above, a vast sea of stars, indifferent to the struggle of a single life below. Lyra stumbled forward, every step heavier than the last. Her vision blurred, her body battered from the crash. The escape pod had barely held together, shielding her from the worst of the impact, but now it was nothing more than a smoldering ruin behind her. She pressed a hand to her side, feeling the warm, sticky flow of blood through her torn suit. Pain radiated through her ribs with every breath. She had to keep moving. Somewhere in the distance, the glow of a settlement flickered against the horizon, barely visible through the heat waves rising from the sand. But it could have been a hallucination. Her strength failed her. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the dunes. Her last thought before darkness took her was that this was a fitting end, alone, lost, forgotten. But fate had other plans. Ronan had learned long ago that this planet swallowed the weak. The desert was merciless, its heat and sandstorms more deadly than any war he had ever fought in. He had come here to escape, to disappear from the galaxy's endless conflicts. Yet, as he crouched beside the fallen figure in the sand, he knew he was about to break the one rule that had kept him alive: stay out of other people's problems. The woman was alien, that much was clear. Her features were too sharp, her skin slightly too pale under the dust. Her suit was torn and bloodied, revealing injuries that should have already killed her. Ronan sighed. Damn it. He lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the hidden entrance of his outpost. Whatever trouble she had brought with her, it was now his problem too. Waking in a stranger's world. A dull ache throbbed behind Lyra's eyes as she drifted back into consciousness. She felt weightless for a moment, floating in the in-between space of sleep and awareness. But then sensation returned, sharp, immediate. Her body ached, her wounds burned, and something rough scraped against her skin. She was alive. Her eyes shot open. The ceiling above her was made of rough metal panels, some rusted, others patched together with mismatched scrap. Dim lighting cast long shadows across the room. She was lying on a makeshift bed, an old mattress resting atop a pile of crates. Panic surged through her. She bolted upright, but the movement sent pain lancing through her ribs. She gasped, pressing a hand against her bandaged side. Don't do that. The voice was deep, edged with weariness. Lyra turned sharply. A man sat across the room, leaning against a workbench. His dark hair was unkempt, strands falling over his sharp features. His clothes, worn leather, reinforced fabric, spoke of someone used to rough conditions. And his eyes, they held the kind of caution that came from years of surviving alone. Where am I? Lyra's voice was hoarse. The man exhaled slowly, as if debating whether to answer. Then he shrugged. A long way from where you started. Lyra swallowed hard. Memories of the crash flooded back, the alarms blaring, her ship's failing systems, the desperate escape pod launch. She should have died out there. But this man had saved her. She eyed him warily. Who are you? Ronan, he said simply. The name meant nothing to her. She studied him, trying to gauge his intentions. Why did you bring me here? Ronan pushed himself up from the workbench and crossed the room. He moved with quiet confidence, his footsteps barely making a sound against the metal floor. He stopped near a table cluttered with tools and old tech scraps. Found you half dead in the dunes. Figured if I left you there, the desert would finish the job. Lyra frowned. So you just decided to help me? Ronan smirked, but there was no humor in it. No, I decided not to watch you die. He tossed something onto the table, a bloodied piece of her torn flight suit. Lyra's stomach tightened at the sight of it. You're lucky you're not dead, Ronan continued. That suit of yours wasn't doing much to keep you alive. You're patched up now, but you need rest. Lyra's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. She had no idea who this man was or what he might want. She had been hunted before, saved only to be sold off later. Her gaze flickered to the door. Locked. Ronan must have noticed. If you're thinking about running, don't. The desert will kill you before anyone else does. Lyra clenched her fists. What do you want from me? Ronan leaned against the table, arms crossed. Nothing. She narrowed her eyes. Then why help me? Ronan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You ask a lot of questions for someone who was dying a few hours ago. Silence settled between them. Ronan turned away, picking up a small device from the table. He began fiddling with it, his attention seemingly elsewhere. But Lyra wasn't fooled, he was still watching her, assessing her every move. Her head ached, and exhaustion tugged at her limbs. For now, she had no choice but to stay. But she would find out who this man really was. And more importantly, she would find a way to leave. Waking in a stranger's world. A dull ache throbbed behind Lyra's eyes as she drifted back into consciousness. She felt weightless for a moment, floating in the in-between space of sleep and awareness. But then sensation returned, sharp, immediate. Her body ached, her wounds burned, and something rough scraped against her skin. She was alive. Her eyes shot open. The ceiling above her was made of rough metal panels, some rusted, others patched together with mismatched scrap. Dim lighting cast long shadows across the room. She was lying on a makeshift bed, an old mattress resting atop a pile of crates. Panic surged through her. She bolted upright, but the movement sent pain lancing through her ribs. She gasped, pressing a hand against her bandaged side. Don't do that. The voice was deep, edged with weariness. Lyra turned sharply. A man sat across the room, leaning against a workbench. His dark hair was unkempt, strands falling over his sharp features. His clothes, worn leather, reinforced fabric, spoke of someone used to rough conditions. And his eyes, they held the kind of caution that came from years of surviving alone. Where am I? Lyra's voice was hoarse. The man exhaled slowly, as if debating whether to answer. Then he shrugged. A long way from where you started. Lyra swallowed hard. Memories of the crash flooded back, the alarms blaring, her ship's failing systems, the desperate escape pod launch. She should have died out there. But this man had saved her. She eyed him warily. Who are you? Ronan, he said simply. The name meant nothing to her. She studied him, trying to gauge his intentions. Why did you bring me here? Ronan pushed himself up from the workbench and crossed the room. He moved with quiet confidence, his footsteps barely making a sound against the metal floor. He stopped near a table cluttered with tools and old tech scraps. Found you half dead in the dunes. Figured if I left you there, the desert would finish the job. Lyra frowned. So you just decided to help me? Ronan smirked, but there was no humor in it. No, I decided not to watch you die. He tossed something onto the table, a bloodied piece of her torn flight suit. Lyra's stomach tightened at the sight of it. You're lucky you're not dead, Ronan continued. That suit of yours wasn't doing much to keep you alive. You're patched up now, but you need rest. Lyra's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. She had no idea who this man was or what he might want. She had been hunted before, saved only to be sold off later. Her gaze flickered to the door. Locked. Ronan must have noticed. If you're thinking about running, don't. The desert will kill you before anyone else does. Lyra clenched her fists. What do you want from me? Ronan leaned against the table, arms crossed. Nothing. She narrowed her eyes. Then why help me? Ronan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You ask a lot of questions for someone who was dying a few hours ago. Silence settled between them. Ronan turned away, picking up a small device from the table. He began fiddling with it, his attention seemingly elsewhere. But Lyra wasn't fooled, he was still watching her, assessing her every move. Her head ached, and exhaustion tugged at her limbs. For now, she had no choice but to stay. But she would find out who this man really was. And more importantly, she would find a way to leave. Shadows of the past. Lyra lay awake long after Ronan had left the room. The soft hum of machinery echoed through the walls, but beyond that, there was silence. No wind, no voices, just the quiet isolation of wherever she had been brought. Though her body ached and exhaustion clung to her, sleep refused to come. Ronan had said he wanted nothing from her, but Lyra had been in the galaxy long enough to know that wasn't how things worked. Kindness always had a cost. Her fingers traced the bandages wrapped around her ribs. The pain was duller now, proof that she had been treated with some level of care. But that didn't mean she was safe. She had to be ready. Pushing herself up from the mattress, Lyra swung her legs over the side of the makeshift bed. Her boots were gone, her uniform stripped down to the bare essentials. Ronan had removed anything that could be used as a weapon. Smart. But he hadn't accounted for her resourcefulness. She scanned the room. It was small, cluttered with old tech, rusted metal crates, and parts of machines she didn't recognize. There was only one exit, a thick metal door that had been shut after Ronan left. Her fingers brushed over a small rusted pipe beneath the bed frame. A crude weapon, but it was better than nothing. She gripped it tightly, pushing herself up on unsteady legs. She needed to figure out where she was. And more importantly, who Ronan really was. The door wasn't locked. Lyra hesitated before easing it open, peering out into the dimly lit corridor beyond. The place wasn't a ship, that much was clear. The walls were worn and patched with scrap metal, and the air had the scent of sand and oil. It was a bunker, hidden, isolated. Who was this man? She moved carefully, her bare feet silent against the metal floor. The hallway stretched ahead, leading into what looked like a workshop. The flickering light of a fire cast long shadows along the walls. Ronan was there, hunched over a table, his back to her. His fingers worked quickly, repairing a device she didn't recognize. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing scarred forearms. This wasn't just some scavenger, Ronan had seen battle. Lyra tightened her grip on the pipe. She could strike now. Catch him off guard, demand answers. But something held her back. Instead, she stepped forward. You left the door open, she said. Ronan didn't startle. He simply glanced at her, then returned his attention to the device in his hands. Didn't think you'd be stupid enough to run, he said. Lyra narrowed her eyes. You don't know me. Ronan smirked, setting down his tools. I know you can barely stand without wincing. You wouldn't make it 5 minutes outside. Her grip on the pipe tightened. Why are you keeping me here? Ronan leaned back against the workbench, arms crossed. You're free to leave whenever you want. But if you do, don't expect to come crawling back when the desert swallows you whole. Lyra hated that he was right. She glanced at the room around her. Scraps of technology, half-built machines, old weapons. Ronan was more than just a scavenger. Who are you? She asked again. Ronan studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Just someone trying to stay out of the wrong kind of trouble. Lyra scoffed. So you live alone in a bunker in the middle of nowhere? That doesn't sound suspicious at all. Ronan chuckled. Says the woman who crash-landed in the middle of nowhere. Lyra frowned but said nothing. Ronan pushed away from the workbench. "Come on," he said, motioning for her to follow. Lyra hesitated, but curiosity won over caution. She followed him down another hallway until they reached a heavy metal door. Ronan pressed a sequence into a keypad, and the door groaned as it slid open. Blinding sunlight poured in, forcing Lyra to squint. Outside, endless dunes stretched across the horizon, the sand shimmering under the harsh light of twin suns. But what caught her attention wasn't the desert. It was the wreckage. Scattered across the dunes were the remains of ships, dozens of them. Some were half buried in the sand, others broken into jagged pieces. Her breath caught. Ronan watched her carefully. "Welcome to the graveyard." Lyra turned to him. "What is this place?" Ronan exhaled. "A dumping ground. A battlefield. Depends on who you ask." Lyra's stomach twisted. She knew what this was. A war had been fought here once, a brutal, merciless battle between factions that had long since vanished. But the scars of the conflict remained. She had heard rumors of places like this. Places where ships disappeared, where survivors never returned. "How long have you been here?" she asked. Ronan's expression darkened. "Long enough." Lyra's mind raced. If this was what she thought it was, then she was in more danger than she realized. She turned back to the wreckage, scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, her ship, what was left of it, was buried in the sand. And with it, the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. She had to find it. No matter what. The forgotten past. Lyra stood frozen at the entrance of the bunker, staring out at the wreckage that stretched endlessly before her. The graveyard of ships, battered and broken by time, sent a chill through her bones despite the desert heat. This wasn't just a battlefield. It was a graveyard of forgotten wars. Ronan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Whatever you're looking for, it's out there, isn't it?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. She kept her gaze locked on the sand dunes where the twisted remains of countless vessels lay in silent decay. Finally, she turned to him. "I need to find my ship." Ronan let out a slow breath. "Figured as much. Can you help me?" He studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "Depends." Lyra clenched her jaw. "On what?" Ronan pushed off the doorframe and started walking back inside. "On whether or not you tell me the truth." Lyra hesitated before following him. Inside, the cool shadows of the bunker provided some relief from the relentless sun. Ronan moved through the space with a purpose, grabbing a canteen of water and placing it on the table. "Sit." Lyra crossed her arms. "I'd rather stand." Ronan smirked. "Suit yourself." He unscrewed the cap of the canteen and took a sip. "I've seen people come through here before. Scavengers, outlaws, mercenaries. But you? You don't fit any of those." Lyra remained silent. Ronan set the canteen down. "So tell me, Lyra. Who are you really?" The room felt smaller all of a sudden. Lyra took a slow breath. She had spent years running, hiding, surviving. Trusting no one. But she couldn't do this alone. "I was a pilot," she admitted, voice quieter than she intended. "Not just any pilot. I flew for the Resistance." Ronan's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched against the table. She watched his reaction carefully. "The Resistance," he repeated. Lyra nodded. "My squadron was ambushed. I barely made it out alive. My ship went down somewhere in the wreckage outside." Ronan exhaled through his nose. "And what's on your ship that's so important?" Lyra hesitated. Ronan picked up on it immediately. "You're still not telling me everything." Lyra's fingers curled into fists. Trust was a dangerous thing. But right now, Ronan was the only one who could help her. My ship has something hidden inside, she admitted. Something that could change everything. Ronan's gaze darkened. What kind of something? Lyra swallowed. A data core. Ronan stared at her for a long moment. You mean to tell me, he said slowly, that somewhere out there, buried under the wreckage of 100 dead ships, is a resistance data core? Lyra nodded. Ronan let out a sharp laugh. Great. Just great. Will you help me or not? Lyra asked. Ronan sighed, running a hand down his face. This is insane. So is living alone in a desert wasteland, she shot back. Ronan smirked. Fair point. He grabbed a set of goggles from a nearby shelf and tossed them to her. Fine. Let's go find your ship. The heat was relentless. Lyra and Ronan moved carefully through the wreckage, stepping over rusted beams and shattered hulls. Ronan had taken the lead, his movements confident as if he had walked this path 100 times before. How do you know your way around so well? Lyra asked. Ronan didn't look back. Because I've spent years mapping it. Lyra frowned. Why? Ronan hesitated. Then he sighed. Because I was looking for something, too. Lyra studied him carefully. Did you find it? Ronan's jaw tightened. No. Lyra didn't press further. Instead, she turned her focus back to the wreckage. Every step forward brought back memories, of fire, of screams, of the moment her ship had spiraled toward the ground in a haze of smoke and sparks. She forced herself to stay focused. The data core was the only thing that mattered. There, Ronan said, pointing ahead. Lyra's heart pounded as she saw it. Half buried in the sand, tilted at an awkward angle, was the remains of her ship. She took off running. The closer she got, the more she saw the damage. The hull was torn open, scorch marks covering the metal. The impact had destroyed most of the exterior, leaving only fragments of what had once been a sleek resistance fighter. But she didn't care about any of that. Her eyes locked onto the cockpit. The data core was still inside. But they weren't alone. Ronan grabbed her arm, stopping her in her tracks. Lyra turned, about to protest, but then she saw what he was looking at. Movement. Figures emerging from the wreckage, shifting through the shadows. Scavengers. Lyra's heart clenched. If they had gotten to the ship first, if they had taken the data core. She couldn't let that happen. Ronan glanced at her. Looks like we've got company. Lyra exhaled sharply. Then we'll just have to deal with them. Ronan grinned. Now you're speaking my language. The fight for survival. Lyra's pulse pounded as she crouched behind the wreckage of her ship, her eyes locked on the approaching scavengers. There were at least 5 of them, moving cautiously through the wreckage, weapons slung across their backs. Ronan knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. They don't look like locals. Lyra shook her head. No, these guys are armed too well. They must have tracked my ship here. Ronan exhaled sharply. So they know about the data core? Or they just want to strip the ship for parts, Lyra whispered. But if they find it, it won't matter. They'll sell it to the highest bidder. Ronan's grip tightened around his sidearm. We can't let that happen. Lyra glanced at him. Are you sure you want to do this? You could just walk away. Ronan smirked. Not my style. Lyra nodded, then turned her focus back to the scavengers. One of them, a tall man with a cybernetic arm, stepped closer to the wreckage. He gestured for the others to fan out. They were searching. Lyra's stomach twisted. They had to move fast. She turned to Ronan. We need to take them out before they find the core. Ronan grinned. Thought you'd never ask. Without another word, he moved swiftly to the left, staying low as he circled around the wreckage. Lyra took the right, gripping the small knife she had taken from Ronan's bunker. Her hands were steady. This wasn't the first time she'd had to fight for her life. The first scavenger never saw her coming. Lyra struck fast, her blade flashing as she drove it into the gap between his armor plates. He let out a strangled gasp, eyes widening in shock before he collapsed. She caught him before he could hit the ground. One down. She turned just in time to see Ronan take down another, a sharp crack echoing through the wreckage as his pistol fired. The remaining scavengers spun around, weapons raised. Intruders, one of them shouted. Lyra cursed and dove for cover as gunfire erupted around her. Ronan slid behind a rusted beam, returning fire with practiced ease. Well, so much for the element of surprise. Lyra's breath came fast. We need to get inside the ship. If they realize what's in there. I'm on it. Ronan moved first, sprinting toward the broken hull. Lyra followed, ducking as bullets ricocheted off the metal around them. They reached the ship just as one of the scavengers tossed a grenade. Ronan yanked Lyra inside a split second before the explosion rocked the ground behind them. Debris rained down. Dust filled the air. Lyra coughed, pushing herself up. We need to move. Ronan groaned. Yeah. I'm good. Just maybe next time, you can warn me about the part where we almost get blown up. Lyra ignored him, already moving toward the cockpit. Her fingers traced the edge of the console, searching. There. Hidden beneath a panel, just as she had left it. She pried it open, revealing a small, metallic sphere no larger than her fist. The data core. Her heart pounded. She had it. But the moment of relief was short-lived. Footsteps. Fast. They weren't alone. The scavenger leader was the first to step through the wreckage, his cybernetic arm gleaming in the dim light. His cold, artificial eyes locked onto Lyra. Hand it over, he demanded, raising his weapon. Lyra tightened her grip on the data core. Ronan cursed under his breath. Not really in the mood to negotiate, are you? The leader smirked. You're outnumbered. And trapped. So yes, I'd say negotiations are over. Lyra's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Her gaze flicked to the ship's console. Maybe there was. She took a slow step backward, positioning herself near the control panel. The scavenger leader didn't seem to notice. Last chance, he warned. Lyra gave him a smile. Then she hit the emergency thruster switch. The ship roared to life, engines sputtering as they released a sudden, violent blast of energy. The shockwave sent the scavengers flying. Ronan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lyra's arm, yanking her through the wreckage as the ship groaned under the strain. They ran. Gunfire chased them through the ruins, but the dust and chaos gave them enough cover to escape. By the time they reached the dunes, the scavengers were long gone. Ronan doubled over, catching his breath. Remind me never to let you near a control panel again. Lyra grinned, holding up the data core. But it worked. Ronan shook his head. You're insane. Lyra just smiled. The data core was safe. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The revelation. The ship's engine hummed softly, filling the dimly lit room with a low, rhythmic pulse. Lyra sat on the metal floor, her back against the cold wall, staring at the encrypted holodrive in her hands. It was the last thing she had left from the wreckage of her old life, her home, her people, everything that had been stolen from her. Ronan watched her from across the room. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp but unreadable. Are you finally going to tell me what's on that thing? He asked. Lyra hesitated, fingers tightening around the drive. It's proof, she said quietly. Ronan raised an eyebrow. Proof of what? She exhaled. Of why the Empire wanted me dead. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Lyra activated the holodrive. A faint blue glow filled the space as the projection flickered to life. The first image showed a planet, lush, vibrant, covered in golden forests and crystalline lakes. That's, Ronan's breath caught. That's your homeworld, isn't it? Lyra nodded. The image shifted. A series of documents, sealed with the emblem of the Empire, scrolled across the screen. Classified records. Then came the footage. Lyra's heart pounded as she watched. Her people, gathered in the city's grand square, unarmed. Imperial ships hovered above them. And then, without warning, the sky burned. The Empire had erased her planet in a single day. Lyra clenched her fists, her body shaking. They said it was an accident, she whispered. A resource mining catastrophe. But it wasn't. They slaughtered us. Ronan stared at the footage, jaw tight. Why? He asked. Lyra looked at him, pain and fury in her gaze. Because we weren't supposed to exist. The holodrive projected genetic records next. Lyra's breath hitched as she saw her own name, her birth designation, listed among others. The files described a program. A hidden imperial experiment. Her people had been created, not born. Hybrids. A secret blend of human and alien DNA, designed for something the Empire never intended the galaxy to know. The program had failed. And so the Empire erased them. Ronan let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. So you weren't just a survivor, his voice was low. You were the last one. Lyra nodded. She had spent years running, never knowing why the Empire hunted her so relentlessly. Now, the truth was staring back at her, projected in cold, undeniable light. Ronan turned to her, his expression unreadable. What are you going to do? Lyra took a shaky breath. I'm going to make sure the entire galaxy knows. The ship landed in a quiet sector of the colony. They had come to find one person, Darius, a skilled underground hacker who specialized in exposing Imperial secrets. He was waiting for them in a dimly lit den, surrounded by outdated consoles and tangled wires. I heard you were bringing me something good, Darius said, his tone amused. Lyra didn't waste time. She handed him the holodrive. Get this to every network you can. Darius plugged it into his system, his fingers flying over the keys. As the files decrypted, his smirk vanished. Stars, he whispered. This is war. Lyra met his gaze. Then let's start one. Darius exhaled sharply. Then he hit send. Alarms blared. Ronan cursed. They're here. Darius turned his screen. The Empire's already trying to shut down the transmission. We need to hold them off long enough for the data to spread. Lyra grabbed her weapon. Then let's make them regret finding us. Outside, Imperial soldiers closed in. The storm had begun. But Lyra was done running. This time, she was fighting back. The final stand. The colony's underground network flickered with emergency lights, casting long shadows along the metallic corridors. The hum of approaching Imperial soldiers echoed through the tunnels, their boots striking against the cold steel floors in perfect synchronization. Lyra's heart pounded as she tightened her grip on her blaster. This was it. The moment she had been running from her entire life had finally come. Ronan crouched beside her, his own weapon primed. Darius was behind them, frantically typing into his console, trying to push the broadcast further across the galaxy before the Empire's firewalls shut it down. You need to buy me 5 more minutes, Darius muttered, his voice tense. That's all I need. 5 minutes, Ronan whispered back. You might as well ask for 5 years. Lyra inhaled sharply, forcing her mind to clear. Then we hold them off. The first wave of soldiers stormed in, their armor glinting under the flickering lights. Energy blasts filled the air. Lyra ducked behind a crate, returning fire with practiced precision. One soldier collapsed. Another staggered backward as Ronan's shot hit its mark. But there were too many. Lyra gritted her teeth as she saw reinforcements flooding in from the far end of the tunnel. They weren't here to capture her anymore. They were here to kill her. Ronan cursed. We're getting pinned down. Darius's console beeped loudly. Almost there. But the enemy was too close. An Imperial officer in dark red armor stepped forward, raising a weapon unlike anything Lyra had seen before. A suppression field emitter. If he activated it, it would shut down their weapons, leaving them defenseless. Lyra didn't think. She moved. With a sharp inhale, she broke cover, sprinting across the battlefield. Blaster shots seared past her, the heat brushing against her skin, but she didn't stop. The officer saw her coming, but he was too slow. She lunged forward, knocking him off balance, gripping the emitter in his hand and twisting. With a crack, the device was ripped from his grasp. Lyra didn't hesitate, she drove the butt of her blaster into his helmet, sending him crumpling to the ground. But the victory was short-lived. Pain exploded across her ribs as a shot struck her side. She gasped, stumbling backward. Ronan's furious roar echoed through the tunnels as he unloaded a barrage of fire, covering her retreat. She collapsed behind cover, pressing a hand to her wound. Warm blood seeped through her fingers. Ronan was suddenly beside her, his expression tight with worry. "Stay with me," he ordered. Lyra clenched her jaw. "Keep fighting." Darius let out a triumphant yell. "It's done. The transmission is live." But then his face paled. "They're triggering the failsafe." Lyra's breath caught. She knew what that meant. If the Empire couldn't stop the transmission, they'd destroy everything in the vicinity to keep it from spreading further. A low rumble shook the walls. Ronan's eyes darkened. "We need to get out. Now." Lyra forced herself to her feet. "Not without making sure they pay for what they've done." The colony's tunnels erupted in chaos. The Empire's failsafe had activated self-destruct protocols, and the entire underground complex was beginning to collapse. Fires raged in the distance as explosions tore through the metallic structure. Ronan led the way, guiding them toward the emergency exit. Darius clutched the holodrive tightly, making sure the original files remained intact. "We won't make it before this place comes down on us," Darius shouted. Lyra ignored the pain in her side, forcing herself to move faster. As they reached the final corridor, the walls groaned. The roof began to cave. A massive chunk of metal plummeted toward them. Lyra pushed Darius forward, bracing herself. But Ronan yanked her out of the way just in time. They crashed onto the ground as debris slammed behind them, blocking the path they had just escaped from. Panting, Lyra looked up. They had made it. Barely. Outside, the cold night air bit at her skin. The colony lay in ruins, but the stars above remained unchanged. Darius checked his device, his fingers shaking. "It's still transmitting," he whispered. "Every major network is picking it up." The Empire's secret was out. Lyra exhaled, her body trembling with exhaustion. Ronan placed a hand on her shoulder. "They'll come for us," he said. "They won't stop." Lyra lifted her gaze to the sky. The Empire would hunt them. But she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just running. She was fighting back. And this was only the beginning. The end.